Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Pat Boerter. This is Putting It All Together. We have a very interesting topic today. Along with me, Jay Fidell from Thinktech Hawaii, and we're going to talk today about the topic of a reserve currency. We know that the United States dollar has been under a lot of stress as a result of recent events, including the meltdown of 2009, in which because of defaulted mortgages, the credit default swaps came into being, which put AIG insurance in risk of default, which put all the businesses in the United States, including General Electric and General Motors, and all the car manufacturers, into peril. And
how does that work, though, Pat? I mean, so you put pressure on all these companies; they're not doing so well. The U.S. doesn't look so good in the international markets, but how does that put pressure on the American dollar? How does that work? What's the process?
The reserve currency, Jay, has a long history. It goes back to the Greeks, the Romans, the Italians, the Spanish, our immediate predecessors, the British. The British pound sterling has typically been a strong currency, but after World War I and by the end of World War II, it was anemic because they had spent themselves into poverty in order to finance those two world wars. So in 1944, what's called the Bretton Woods Accord came into being, whereas the 40 most commercial countries in the world, with World War II about to be won, but not quite there. And they agreed that the reserve currency of the world would be the U.S. dollar.
And up to that point, it had not been.
It hadn't been until that point. The British, preceded by the Spanish, preceded by the Italians, the Romans, the Greeks. And what a reserve currency is the currency of the most powerful country in the world, one readily accessible and highly reliable to all other countries in the world. The whole idea is to be able to do business between the countries of the world with a currency that is so notably strong that everyone agrees that it could not fail. It's too, in effect, the reserve currency is too good to fail. It's too reliable to fail. And of course, after World War II, the U.S. dollar was regarded quite rightly as just that currency.
But the Brits, had enjoyed this fantastic opportunity of having their currency be the pound, I guess, being the primary currency. And now they gave it up at Bretton Woods. That was a great loss for them. Did they resist? Did they say no? Did they try to negotiate to the contrary?
By the time that the Bretton Woods Conference was held in New Hampshire in '44, the British pretty well acknowledged that the pound had taken a beating from all of the various military operations they'd had to go through. And of course, everybody, all the commercial countries, the free market countries of the world, want a stable currency upon which they can rely, and the U.S. dollar fulfilled that requirement. So in the interests of smoother commerce, they were only too willing to surrender that status.
But when you get that status, it's not only that everybody, uses your currency, it's that you have tremendous prestige. You are the world leader financially by definition, isn't it? To have that status, enormous benefit for your own economy.
That's quite true. What John Kennedy once identified as Pax Americana, in other words, in an American enforced peace, that comes hand in hand with being the reserve currency. The reserve currency tends to be the currency not only of the most financially secure country, but also the most military powerful country, and that's been true ever since ancient times. So not surprising at all that we would inherit that mantle after World War II, because Franklin Roosevelt promised to produce 50,000 airplanes, and he failed in that. He produced 100,000. So we shocked everybody, including ourselves, at how much we were able to do. And I'm not the first person to suggest that the Depression ended not at the hands of FDR, but at the hands of Adolf Hitler, because we produced a lot of what suddenly became necessary, and we forced ourselves into prosperity almost by accident. But we are at a point now, when you look at 2009, what had happened is both Presidents Clinton and Bush had seriously hawked, I think you can say, home ownership, to the point where Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae were offering deals to people to get mortgages to people who obviously could not afford to pay. And when these mortgages were undertaken, they were commoditized by making stocks out of them and selling stocks to people, and that worked for a while. But as soon as people began to default in large numbers on their loans, then these became what came to be known as toxic assets. That's what triggered AIG's involvement, because AIG insured, in effect, what came to be known as credit default swaps. In other words, the swap occurred when the buyer, who realized they had a worthless asset, returned the bond or the stock over to the seller, but was paid to their loss by AIG. That's when Warren Buffett literally had to step in and backstop AIG to the point of $5 billion. So we had private individuals who had no obligation to do so, suddenly backstopping the greenback. At this point, the Treasury Secretary and the New York Fed chair, who was Tim Geithner, who would succeed Paulson as Secretary of the Treasury, called in the big banks and just said, you know, we're going to make you take money that's called TARP. It's Troubled Assets Recovery Program. And Ben Bernanke correctly observed that the real problem we had wasn't necessarily the failure of the stock market. In 1929, the market failed, but that was just a symptom. What really happened was that credit dried up, and that wasn't identified in time, and so we got into a depression. And really, between Hoover and Roosevelt, they essentially took the same steps, although in different degree, and we stayed in a depression for 12 years until the advent of World War II. So what happened was the banks were forced to take money. J.P. Morgan was forced to take $25 billion. Out on the West Coast, Wells Fargo needed only $2 billion because they hadn't dealt in these toxic assets as much. Did they actually loan the money out? No, they didn't. But the idea was to give the public the impression that there was liquidity, that money was available for people who wanted to borrow it. In reality, we know even to the present day that money isn't available. Money is as tight as it ever was.
This is why Warren Buffett did it also, right?
He wanted to give AIG liquidity on paper so that if these claims came in wholesale, it's as if everybody, if you remember It's a Wonderful Life, all of a sudden George Bailey is at the window and everybody wants to close their account, and there isn't enough money for everybody to close their account. So Warren Buffett came in, guaranteed AIG for $5 billion, and got a good deal out of it himself for lending them that money. And that's what gave the appearance of liquidity. Even to this day, a lot of meritorious mortgagees, people who want to buy a house, still can't do it because the lending institutions have the jitters, and now their requirements are so great that if you don't have 35% down and a really good job with a long history, they won't loan you the money.
So it's confidence. It's a confidence game. It's a psychology thing, and if you get people to feel that there's value there, that the market is built on prosperity, there's lots of money, more money where that came from, then your currency will be strong, your paper will be strong, your economy will be strong. I think people forget that. It's not just the numbers. It's the psychology.
Nor is it just the big banks. We talk about too big to fail, and that encounters a great deal of resentment from people because they feel that the big creditors, when the big creditors become big debtors, the government will bail them out because 77% of the assets in the United States are owned by 10 banks. So that these banks are too big to fail. Ironically, just today, I heard on one of the news shows that a couple of foreign banks may be criminally indicted by the Obama Justice Department. So now the question is, who's too big to jail? But
That's very good.
yeah, it's funny in that way.
But he didn't do that before. Back in 2008, when it all went, in a handbasket, he wasn't prosecuting. His investigations were going soft. Remember that movie? I forget what it was called now. It was a Charles Peterson, I think his name was, who made this wonderful movie about what happened on Wall Street in 2008, and it didn't work very well.
There were several good movies. Too Big to Fail was Andrew Ross Sorkin's movie from his book. The book is excellent, and it talks about the very weaknesses in the U.S. dollar and raises the question of whether or not the dollar will remain the reserve currency. When we get later into the program, I want to at least indulge in the hypothesis, because another book, The Death of Money, goes one step further than that and says we are incurring debt so fast, with $80 billion per month invested by the Federal Reserve into bonds in order to keep the economy liquid, that by the end of the present administration, the Federal Reserve will have accounted for $17 trillion in debt. And there comes a point where a country not only can no longer sustain reserve currency status, it may not even be solvent. In other words, is there a point when the United States becomes so much in debt that nobody trusts us anymore?
Well, I think that, in the 2008 thing, the failure to prosecute, all the problems that came out under the rug in that period, we lost confidence. I mean, people in the country lost confidence, and people outside the country lost confidence. And I think that confidence is, a principal part of the economy in general. But on what you're talking about, on reserve currency, that's world confidence. And if the world loses confidence in the dollar, we will lose the benefit of having it as the reserve currency, I think.
Well, and if you go one step further, the next question you have to ask is there another currency waiting in the wings that would replace the dollar?
Sure.
And we should talk about that. Let's go over, later in the program, we'll go over the various countries that might find themselves in the position of having a reserve currency. Now, the U.S. is not universally loved throughout the world. There's no mystery there. And so you have to take into account the fact that numerous countries are not at all satisfied with the notion that the U.S. dollar is the reserve currency. I went to Vietnam in 1993. This is 2 years before Clinton recognized the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, and decades after a bitter decade-long war in which millions of Vietnamese on both sides of the line were killed. And I went only to discover, to my utter amazement, that the de facto currency of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam was the U.S. dollar. In fact, it was comical, because when I got to Saigon, I said to myself, I'm going to go native. I want to have Vietnamese dong, and I want to spend the Vietnamese dong. So I changed $50, and they gave me my Vietnamese currency in a brown paper bag. It was so voluminous, that was the only way they could deliver it to me, and that was $50 worth of currency. You know that I've been to North Korea a number of times, and North Korea is a bitter foe of the United States. There are people alive who still remember the bombings of Pyongyang, and yet their de facto currencies, the euro of Western Europe and the greenbacks. In all of the 4 times that I have ever been to North Korea, I've never once spent a North Korean won. I've spent a lot of greenbacks, and they know what Andrew Jackson looks like more than Kim Il-sung. So the dollar is the de facto currency shared with the euro in North Korea. And so those are two countries that aren't necessarily, even to the present day, enamored with the idea that they have to keep the U.S. greenback in stock. So what happens if we cease to be the reserve currency of the world? This is probably the next topic we'll cover in the second segment, but you can certainly see where there are a number of other countries that wouldn't at all be shy about at least sharing the notion of being a regional reserve currency. It's clear in the Middle East that we're not popular at all, and those people would be only too happy to have almost any other currency besides the US dollar. You've got the BRICS, the upcoming really big economies. It's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Those are the people who have dubbed themselves the BRICS. They have no particular need to be dealing in dollars. You have other countries, the Baltic states of Russia, and all of the stands, the Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, who are not particularly close friends of the United States. So there's a myriad of countries that would be only too happy to be dealing with another currency. And it's interesting to ponder which other currencies might satisfy their need.
But one of the elements, you mentioned it yourself, is the transitional issues. In other words, if I say, well, right now, the U.S. is recognized as the world's reserve currency, and I'm going to change it. I'm going to change it to something else. Who knows what? Okay, that is going to involve a lot of transitional issues for a lot of people in a lot of countries, even if they don't like the U.S., even if they prefer not to have, even if they want a regional currency, even if they have a regional currency now. It's just a matter of recognition of another currency is going to make for work, a lot of work to get over the bridge, right?
There are actually two elements that a country would consider before it jettisoned the U.S. dollar. One, of course, would be whether they like us or not, and that's an emotional reason. But the other is whether our currency seems to be reliable, and are we behaving responsibly with respect to our currency. There are two culprits that I would say that are bringing some suspicion on the part of the public. And of course, the first of them is Congress, which simply can't come up with a budget, no matter who you blame. And I'm not here to blame either side. How about both sides? But in any event, that Congress is one institution, and the other, of course, is the Federal Reserve, which it has us on the drug of quantitative easing. Quantitative easing has basically allowed big corporations to have zero interest loans. So here's one of the anomalies that would cause a country to really distrust the U.S. currency. Right now, because the Federal Reserve has zero interest on loans in order to increase liquidity, so you have a company like Apple, which famously has $5, $10, $50 billion in cash. And what do they do when they want money? They take out a loan. And why do they do it? Because there's no disincentive to taking out a loan. The loans are interest-free. They're handed the money by banking institutions. And of course, that is what it amounts to, in effect, is that you and I are paying the interest on Apple's loans, because when you put your money in the bank, you get no interest. That interest is going, in effect, to the benefit of Apple. And that's one of the things that would make another country, a whole series of countries, look at the United States and say, this is counterintuitive. This should not be happening. And anyone with a junior high education would know that that's not how you deal with money. What passes for prosperity in our economy right now is stock buybacks. Because the loans are interest-free, every company that you can think of is buying back its own stock. And that puts it in good stead with the traders on Wall Street. But why? What is happening that increases prosperity by having Apple just simply buy back its own shares? Is very mysterious.
But why do they do it? Do they do it? Well, I guess they do it because they want to encourage existing investors to like them, to think there's great value in the company. They want to improve their own marketability of their own stock.
And you know what, Jay? When we come back from this brief message, that's exactly what we'll be talking about. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Thinktech Hawaii, putting it all together with Jay Fidell and Pat Border. We'll be back in just a moment.
I'm Jay Fidell. That's Sharon Moriwaki of the Hawaii Energy Policy Forum. And every Wednesday we have Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy. We've been doing it for some time now, and we have some fantastic guests on there, unbelievable guests who give us insight into what is going on in a very complex, sometimes very confusing, sometimes very disappointing area of progress in the state. So we love doing this. We love meeting them. We love talking to them. We love having their ideas out on the table. So maybe, just maybe, we can all make some sense of what's going on. Sharon, what do you think?
I think that's absolutely correct. We enjoy ourselves meeting with all these people and hearing about the energy and the state of clean energy, and hopefully we advance clean energy for the state. So it's terrific. Join us.
Okay, it's every Wednesday. Okay, Wednesday is Energy Day. Every Wednesday, 4 to 5 p.m. Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy, here on Thinktech Hawaii. We'll see you there.
Well, good afternoon again, everybody. Jay Fidell and I are back. This is Thinktech Hawaii, putting it all together. And this afternoon, we're talking about a topic which is actually of crucial importance to U.S. citizens, but one that is not often talked about precisely because nobody quite knows what's going to happen, and that is the reserve currency. The reserve currency is that currency which is universally, or at least widely, recognized as an international currency, one that is so reliable that it can be used to strike deals between two-third countries, and it's a currency that helps to define the value of other currencies. The US dollar, for instance, is what defines the value of a Japanese yen. You figure out what a yen is worth by saying, well, how many dollars will it buy? And right now, the dollar has regained some of its value, so a yen costs basically, well, 104 yen would buy you a dollar. The two currencies which are more valuable than the US dollar right now would include the euro. Right now, you would have to come up with $1.35 or thereabouts in order to get 1 euro. You'd have to come up with about somewhere between $1.67 and $1.70 to come up with a British pound. An interesting currency because it sort of goes back and forth between more valuable and less valuable is the Canadian dollar. Over the past couple of years, a Canadian dollar would cost $1.04 of U.S. currency. Now, the U.S. dollar is a bit stronger, so the U.S. dollar the Canadian dollar would be worth about 99 cents U.S. So
can we go back for a minute, Pat, to the euro? You know, it wasn't, a year or two ago when the euro was under pressure and Greece was failing and other euro states in the Eurozone were failing. I mean, maybe they still are. I haven't heard the end of that. But when that happens, then the euro suffers, right, in the eyes of the world. Again, a confidence game. Are we finished with that? Is the euro now coming back to the point where it exceeds, that the confidence of the euro exceeds the confidence of the dollar?
Whether it presently exceeds the value of a dollar in relative confidence is a difficult matter to measure. When do you get to the point where the dollar is no longer trusted? That's intuitive, and it may be a ways away or it may be close. We really don't know. The point that I would make with respect to the euro and the Eurozone is that they made a conscious political decision over the years to create a single currency and to stand by it from beginning to end, no matter what. And the countries that first showed some instability were Greece and Portugal. Spain and Ireland have shown a little bit of that instability as well. But the Germans have stepped forward and simply said, we expect austerity programs to be undertaken, but we will backstop the Eurozone. And you know, if you've ever spent euros, you know that the currency, the paper currency, is identical no matter which of the 13 or so countries you're in. And then the coinage is half generic and half specific to the country. So if you have a 1 franc coin, you know whether it was produced in France or Germany or Holland or Finland or one of the other states. But they made a political decision that they wanted to have a single currency, and they are staying with it. So the answer to your question is that degree of commitment. You had Jean-Claude Trichet from Belgium was the immediate past counterpart to Bernanke, and now it's Mario Draghi from Italy. But they have both said, we will do whatever it takes to keep the euro together and all the euro nations, and the world is starting to believe them. So one of the candidates to succeed the dollar, if we ever get so weak and unreliable, one of the candidates to succeed the dollar would be the euro. Now,
But that's the kind of thing you have to do. You have to say, we will stand by the currency, we will put good money after bad, we'll apply discipline and so forth. We'll even suffer, like the Germans suffered, in order to bail out Portugal and Greece. So, you know, it's a matter of character, and everyone admires that, and it builds confidence. It's really the same process as the fellow you mentioned earlier, the American.
Bernanke.
No, the investor.
Oh, okay.
Whatever. So what I'm getting to, though, in my mind, just listening to the story on this, is that you get to a tipping point where, say, the euro is more powerful than the dollar. Something has to happen. There's no one organization that says we designate this currency or that currency as the reserve currency. Some global political trip has to happen. How does that work?
Well, you've made an interesting observation, because is there that magic Bretton Woods moment when one currency is replaced by another? And that may not happen. Even now, look, in the Eurozone, there are somewhere between 13 and 15 countries, and more to come. I think the Czechs want to be involved, and they're making application to join the Eurozone. When you have countries with their bilateral trade agreements, let's say if you have Germany and France, or Germany and Ireland coming together, could they strike a deal, and because they're both in the Eurozone, simply deal with euros? And I think that's more likely to happen on a regional basis than has happened before. In other words, there isn't going to be some moment of anointment when a currency replaces the US dollar. In 1971, fearing that countries in the world would raid Fort Knox and literally run it dry, Richard Nixon took the US dollar off of the gold standard. And the fact that that was done had the effect, whether intended or not, to undermine the currency somewhat. So the period since World War II, there have been a number of events which have influenced people's view of the dollar. I think at the present time, as the saying goes, the U.S. still is the best house in a bad neighborhood. That's the way people have expressed it.
But you know, the whole thing about
so we're not about to be dethroned in the next moment.
Things have happened that make the world, however they perceive us, lose confidence in our our financial abilities and our fiscal policies and so forth. And I'm talking specifically about the Congress and the Tea Party, action to block, raising the budget ceiling, and this kind of thing. I think gives everyone in the world a bit of lack of confidence in the American dollar. It isn't resolved yet, but I think it's like building blocks. A little lost here, a little lost there, and after a while you reach a tipping point. If you measured global confidence in the American dollar today versus before all that Tea Party kinds of process happened in Washington, we'd be way down because of it, because it raises the question of whether we can actually, pay our debts. Not that we don't have the money, but we don't have the will, the political will to pay our debts, and people get concerned about that, and it's not over. So I think this, and that's where this first came up. What you're talking about, the subject here tonight, is a subject that was really not discussed very much until the Tea Party began to do its machinations against the debt ceiling.
That's true, and no matter which side you are on in that debate, it's vitally important. A lot of the people who presently are in government and in a position of influence feel that the disparity between wealth has gone amok, that the haves have so much more than the have-nots, that the middle class is disappearing, and that's the argument for raising taxes and raising corporate taxes. And the argument has some, it has some legs. And the idea, on the other hand, that no matter what we do, we're always spending more than we take in, also has some currency to it as well. And those two ideas compete with one another. And so fiscal policy is the policy that's made with how do we balance our books. And that's something that the Federal Reserve can't handle. It's not their job to handle taxation policies. And so you'd notice during Bernanke's time that whenever that issue came up, he would defer to the Congress. He says, that's a political decision. You folks have to make that decision. And the problem that we're running into is that we have this analysis paralysis where we simply haven't decided. We went for years without a budget. And I think we have one now that came about very recently, but we have to do something, even if it displeases some people. If we raise taxes, that'll displease some people, but arguably it results in more revenues. And then you get into the laugher people from the Reagan time who say, no, actually, if you lower taxes, you increase revenues. And so that debate will go on forever. And but one of the things that I think we can say is that the middle class is disappearing very quickly. That group of people who live a little bit more well than just paycheck to paycheck, that group is disappearing, and that is a sad reality.
How do you think the Congress's refusal to do an increase in the minimum wage will play in all this?
I can't say. Any one thing is difficult for me to say. I've heard the arguments on both sides that people should be living above the poverty line when they work 40 hours a week, and that's true. And then I've heard people say, well, the McDonald's job is supposed to be entry level. It's not supposed to be a career. And okay, I don't know what the effect is. If an employer has to fire some employees because paying them $10 an hour is too much, I don't know what to say. I can't have an intelligent opinion on it because I'm not an employer. But the fact that we do nothing, the fact that after we argue the merits, nothing happens, is what's getting us into trouble. And the rest of the world can be patient with whichever decision we come to, but we have to decide something. And
So
that's
it's
where we fall down.
It's about process. And I certainly agree with you. The process has been questionable in the last few years. And I mean, it's, again, subjective, but the people around the world look at that and they say, we thought the American process was better. We thought they made their analysis and then they took action. They make an analysis that goes nowhere. They don't take action. They're all arguing and bickering among themselves in Washington. How can we have confidence in a country that can't make decisions?
You're absolutely right. And after this break, we're going to discuss some of the possible more draconian results, even beyond losing this preferred status as the reserve currency. We'll be back in just a minute. It's Jay Fidell and Pat Border putting it together on Thinktech. See you in a minute.
I'm Hong Jiang, host for Asia in Review on Tuesdays. And I'm David Day, host for Asian Review on Thursdays. Both of us broadcast our respective shows at 4 p.m.
And my topics tend to deal with questions related to environment, culture, history, and sometimes human rights.
And my shows tend to be on international business, foreign policy, geopolitics, and national security. And you can watch our shows live on the Thinktech website at thinktechhawaii.com.
And you can also watch us on YouTube or Olalo.
So come join us on Thursdays at 4 p.m. I'm David Day.
And on Tuesdays at 4 p.m., I'm Hong Jiang.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Hello again, everybody. Jay Fidell and Pat Border putting it all together here on Thinktech. We're talking about the U.S. currency as the reserve currency. And the questions that Jay's asking are vitally important because there clearly could come a moment when the U.S. dollar is no longer the most trusted currency in the world. Now, we've always, as long as we've been alive, for most of us, the U.S. currency has been the reserve currency. It has been used throughout the entire world to finance deals and to backstop other countries whose currency is more frail than ours. If they have greenbacks, they're in better shape than they are. Well, will that stay the same or will it change? How do you protect yourself if and when that moment comes when we're so irresponsible collectively that the greenback tanks? What do you do? Well, there's a number of things that have been suggested, and in this program won't recommend one or another, but we will offer you some of the possibilities. During the Depression of the 1930s, people with cash were king. The problem in the 1930s was that you couldn't get your hands on money. Credit had frozen. People couldn't buy the feed, grain, and seeds for their farms, and so the farms went under. So the question, businesses went under because they couldn't get loans. So the question is, what do you do if you get to the point where we have what's defined as another depression, where the greenback just tanks? If you have cash, are you protected? Well, as long as the U.S. currency has some respect, yes, having cash would be of assistance. And in this atmosphere that we're operating in now, where you put your money in a credit union or a bank, there's really no way that you're going to get any interest from it anyway. Put it another way, if you put cash into a safe deposit box, then you're your own ATM. That's the argument for it. So if we had a terrible situation that resulted in what President Roosevelt called a bank holiday, then at least you could be your own ATM, go to your own safe deposit box and pull out money. Now the question becomes more complicated if we get to the point where the US dollar tanks and it becomes viewed as valueless. It no longer has the faith of Americans and people around the world. So this is where, if you're watching the television, particularly if you watch the financial shows, you see people coming on from various of the precious metal sellers and suggesting that you should hold a certain amount of gold and silver in your account. Why would that be beneficial? Well, because just assume hypothetically for the moment that the dollar tanked and was valueless. With precious metal, you could buy any currency you wanted to. So that is the argument for holding precious metal. Certificates for precious metal are a little bit more uncertain. This is where you might buy certificates, shares, if you were, in a gold fund or a silver fund. Can you get to the precious metals if you need to? That's a question that is really unanswered because with the bank holidays, when the government closes the banks, you can't get at your money. So maybe you wouldn't be able to get at those certificates either.
What about trading in currencies? I know a family, they have spent much of their life in Hawaii, who believe they have a system for trading in currencies. And they look at the relative currency changes and they decide they're going to move their money from say Deutschmarks into well, no, that's not a
Well, it's
valid
a euro. It's
from
yeah.
a euro to a British pound to an Australian dollar, and they move it around, and they make money this way because there's always changes. Whenever you have changes, there's the possibility of losing money and making money, and they tend to make money. So therefore, I suggest to you that you don't have to deal with the actual gold or silver. You don't have to deal with the actual American dollars or the American silver dollar or anything like that. You can just go online and trade currencies from one to the other and make money, even when the American dollar is losing ground. No?
You're right about that, and that's usually done through the vehicle of mutual funds or exchange-traded funds, which is just another way of trading mutual funds through a stock exchange. That's a possibility. I'm talking about really the more draconian situation where you're not so much trying to make money off of a transaction as you are to preserve the value that you've earned. In other words, let's say you have $10,000 in U.S. dollars in cash. If the U.S. money becomes worthless or worth less than before, how can you maintain that value? One way to do it might be through mutual funds that bring euro dollars together or euro yen, those sorts of things. Those are already in contemplation. I think the level of desperation is the real question. If you're to the point where the world economic system has fallen apart, then you have to worry about some institution, in effect, at some point giving you the euros that you think belong to you.
Well, you're suggesting, though, Pat, this is really an interesting point. You're suggesting that if the reserve currency changes, again, against the better wishes of the American, of the American, government or financial establishment, then there will be a secondary effect. It's not so much a transition into another currency, is that people will have a crisis of confidence, and they will not be happy with this, and you could have a very dramatic fall in the value of the dollar and other currency changes around the world that may not be controllable by the likes of Warren Buffett, throwing money into a situation to raise confidence. If you lose confidence around the world in a given currency or in all currencies or in the world monetary system, or even in a large region, you're asking for trouble I don't even know what kind of trouble could happen. I just know it would affect everybody.
Well, yes, and if you look at the situation along a gradient, in other words, along, let's say, a rheostat or on a scale, if the U.S. lost its preeminence as the world reserve currency, the currency would still have value. So in that situation, what has been surmised is that because dollars wouldn't be held, because it's not a reserve currency anymore, that our country would be flooded with U.S. dollars, which could cause inflation, although that hasn't happened yet with quantitative easing, so it's difficult to say, very difficult to say. But the most gradual degradation, where we just simply lost our status as the preeminent world currency, wouldn't necessarily destroy the dollar. So that's not so bad. The problem is, because the dollar is so powerful, the failure of the dollar could cause other currencies to topple, including the euro, including the Chinese yuan, including other otherwise stable currencies like the Australian dollar. And when that happens, then you would be in a real draconian system. This book that's written by James Rickards is called The Death of Money, and he believes, this is the most draconian possibility, that with the failing of the US dollar, the entire world system could fall apart. And that's where you really have to look at the possibility of being able to move to a barter system where, if nothing else, you're bartering with a silver coin for a loaf of bread. That's the most draconian possibility.
Well, speaking of that, what about bitcoins? We're talking now about the possible shift of global interest into another currency. What about the emergence of bitcoins? Could they compete in this area? Granted, they're not global yet, But and they've had troubles, and investors have lost money already. They're trying to reorganize it right now. I think it has a future anyway, and in say 2 or 3 years, it might have real legs. And assuming that in 2 or 3 years it has real legs, could it be a contender? That is a currency not associated with any country.
Well, you and I have exchanged views on this topic, and I think it's valuable to touch on it because I am influenced by the fact that the Bitcoin is not underwritten by any government. Its inventors are probably known to somebody, but not to me, and it's already had some failings once. My question for Bitcoin would be, why do we need another currency? What does it give us that other established currencies don't? It sounds cool and vaguely 21st century, but I don't get it. And maybe it's me, but I don't get it. And I think the fact that it's not backed by any government makes me shy away from it completely. I wouldn't want to own a Bitcoin. I don't know what they're worth now. If I bought a suit for 1,000 Bitcoins, and I thought Bitcoins were 25 cents worth, and it turned out they were $1 worth, well, then that might be the most expensive suit I ever contemplated. So I really don't know. I do think that holding foreign currencies, it has some appeal to it because you can do it. But the problem you run into is this. You can't pay your taxes in euros or in gold. You have to, and you don't get paid by your employer in euros or in gold. So it's not an easy process to acquire foreign currencies. And I really don't have an answer to that. And I haven't read or discussed the matter with anybody who does. I don't know the answer to that question. You've gotten me to the verge.
Well, there's one more thing that springs out of it, and that is, we've seen in our lifetime the Eurozone come together. We've seen the euro as an important currency covering many hundreds of millions of people and all those countries, and the number of countries increasing. Could it be that we will see, maybe not in our lifetimes, Pat, but say in the next generation, a global currency emerge, as a strong, in other words, the next reserve currency, whether it be the US dollar or some other currency, maybe the euro, becomes then a global currency where everybody gets on board. Is this possible?
I would say in the brief answer, because we're running out of time, but the brief answer would be no. And the perfect response for that is the Chinese yuan, which is one possible candidate. People are saying already that in 2014, China will exceed the U.S. as the #1 economy. My response to that is, so what? I don't know that makes a huge difference. But the one reason why the yuan would never be the reserve currency is because the Chinese are manipulating it, and everybody knows it. It's 6.6 yuan to the dollar, and it's been that way for a long time. So a world currency I don't see. I think we've run to just about the perfect end because the answer is we don't have the answers. But we hope that as a result of putting it all together today with Jay Fidell and Pat Border, that we've gotten the people of Hawaii aware of the importance of this reserve currency. Does it make a difference to you? Does it make a difference in your life? Our answer is emphatically yes. And I hope we can keep this conversation going. But for today, it's been Jay Fidell and Pat Border putting it all together here on Thinktech Hawaii. Check in with us again. We'll have some more really exciting conversations. That's it for today. Thank you for watching.